This is where it started for me. I grew up as the only obese kid in class. As you can imagine, I was bullied and I felt very different from everyone else. When I was 8 years old, I was playing tag at recess and running after a boy I had a crush on. When I tagged him, in front of the whole school, he yelled, "Fatty caught me." I was mortified. That fateful day, I made a decision that would change my life forever. I decided to go on my very first diet. I had no concept of what a diet meant. I just knew the more I ate, the bigger I got, and so I essentially starved myself. And guess what happened? I received a ton of validation. People around me would say things like, "Look how beautiful you're growing up to be." My doctor said she was proud of me, and all of a sudden, I had all of these friends. I learned that being thin meant I was lovable, and being overweight meant I wasn't. And for the next 2 decades, I desperately chased that feeling through yo-yo dieting, eating disorders, and eventually substance abuse. I was slowly killing myself. My entire life revolved around my weight and my appearance. That all started right there. And so naturally, I thought the best solution was to become a nutritionist, dedicate my entire career to understanding how to remain lean. But a funny thing happened. When I did, my eating behaviors and relationship to food got significantly worse. You see, for many, our connection to food is one of the most valuable relationships we'll ever have. Yet we blame it, shame it, and rename it, anything we can in order to avoid facing it. Our relationship to food is quite literally our relationship to life. Yet we exist in a world where following restrictive fads seem to be the only appropriate way to engage with it. Working as a nutritionist, I saw time and time again. Most people know what's healthy and what's not. Every single patient that walked into the obesity clinic knew an apple was healthier than a chocolate bar. They just continued to choose the chocolate bar anyways. For some people, it's not as simple as eat this and don't eat that. Many factors have contributed to the epidemic of obesity, including processing of foods and sedentary lifestyles. But if it were that simple, a whole food plan and a new gym membership would solve this problem. And yet, despite innovative new research on different types of eating and the evolution of the exercise world, obesity rates continue to rise. If we dig deep, we can see there's a much more complex and psychological relationship to food that keeps people going back for the chocolate bar over and over again. The current solution we have to this problem simply doesn't work. The dieting industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry, this year reaching an all-time high of $224.27 billion. According to Stats Canada, 2 in 3 adults are overweight and 1 in 3 are clinically obese, and rates are actually projected to continue to increase. But if dieting worked, we would never need to diet again, and the dieting industry would not have a very profitable business model. The US Federal Trade Commission states diets actually have a 98% fail rate. This is confirmed through research done by UCLA, which proves the majority of people will regain all of the weight they lost, and sometimes even more within the first 12 months. So if they gained it back, it didn't work. And yet, you and I both know when one diet ends, you continue to threaten yourself with the promise of starting again tomorrow. This is my 1-year-old daughter. And no matter how much she loves cake, when she's done, you can't overfeed her. A baby is never going to cry for food if they aren't hungry. We are born with these very intuitive processes, and somewhere along the way, we become disconnected from our true hunger and full signals. I'll bet you all have at least one friend who just eats when they're hungry and stops when they're full. They eat all kinds of foods, and they never seem to gain a single pound. I promise these people, they do exist. But how is it that more than 50% of the population know what to do, but keep making choices that contradict their goals? How does this very intuitive process of eating become dysregulated and lead to cycles of restriction and overconsumption? Research conducted by Wyss and colleagues in 2020 suggests one of the most prominent predictors of obesity is early life adversity or childhood trauma. Very similar to addiction, traumatic experiences in childhood can change the brain, which makes that individual more likely to seek food to escape or self-soothe. Food is, most often, our first and most accessible drug we are exposed to, and eating becomes a coping mechanism rather than a means for survival. Furthermore, a sure way to create a disconnection between your gut and your brain is through restriction. Eating comes from a very primitive part of the brain. All species have the ability to eat and gain access to food for survival. This primitive part doesn't distinguish between good and bad food. You would never see a dog eating a milkshake thinking, this is gonna make me fat. We need food to survive, and the brain is wired for survival, not success. So when we restrict certain foods, the primitive brain thinks it's in danger and begins to shut down higher order functions like impulse control. The next time we have access to that food, we are going to overindulge as a self-preservation mechanism. Forbidden fruit tastes the sweetest. The more you restrict, the more likely you are to overindulge. Finally, our relationship to food can become quite toxic through the thoughts we have about what we're eating. The body is governed by an elaborate nervous system where there are signals going from the brain to the body and back up to the brain. Your thoughts about what you're eating are more important than the food itself. There's an incredible study done by Aaliyah Crum and her colleagues in 2011 called Mind Over Milkshake. They took two identical milkshakes, and they labeled one highly caloric, and they labeled the other low caloric. And then they measured biometrics of individuals who consumed them. When the group consumed what they thought was the highly caloric milkshake, their body released a high level of hormones related to hunger, as if they were drinking something highly caloric. When the group consumed what they thought was the low caloric milkshake, their body released a much lower level of hormones related to hunger, as if they were drinking something that was low caloric. But the milkshakes were identical. This research study proves that your thoughts about what you're eating can literally change the physiological and biochemical response your body has despite what you're actually consuming. For over a decade, working as a nutritionist, I handed out dozens of meal plans. Nobody got any better, and I continued to struggle with my weight and my relationship to food. It wasn't until I went back to school to study human behavior and psychology that I began putting these pieces together. I began to understand how my own psychology and feelings of inadequacy as a child led to unhealthy coping mechanisms with eating. Because no matter how much weight I lost, I still never liked myself. When I recovered my relationship to food, I began to see a life beyond calorie counting and meal plans. I was able to address my low self-worth, stop trying to control my diet, and develop a healthy narrative around what I was eating. And a funny thing happened. The excess weight stabilized and came off all on its own. Now, this is not another story about weight loss. It's so much more than that. This idea is about getting your life back, increasing confidence, and finding the truest, healthiest version of you without having to give up your favorite foods. So what can we take from all of this? I want you to imagine a life free from restriction and food obsession, a life where you don't have to undo your dinner, exercise the holiday meals away, or starve yourself to fit into a bikini. When you normalize your relationship to food, eating is easy. You eat when you're hungry, you stop when you're full. You can trust yourself around all foods, and your body knows how to digest and metabolize with ease. This is the psychology of food. Here are a few steps you can take right now. The first thing is you need to be able to distinguish between true hunger and a craving. I can't tell you how many times I've walked into my kitchen, opening up cupboard after cupboard, not finding anything to satiate me in that moment. That is not true hunger. A sure way to tell is to just ask yourself this one question. Would I eat raw broccoli right now? And if the answer is no, you're probably not hungry. The second thing is to break up with restriction. Restricting foods, tracking, calorie counting, high carb, low carb, following somebody else's meal plan doesn't work. The third is to meet yourself with compassion. You can't hate your way to a body that you love. Speaking negatively about yourself or your body only increases the desire to self-soothe. And the fourth is to use your brain. The body follows the mind. Your thoughts are powerful and they direct the body how to behave, so choose them wisely. Because the truth is, we all have to eat. So food might be one of the most significant relationships you'll ever have. Everywhere we look, there is so much chatter about health and nutrition, and yet the conversation nobody wants to have is the most important one. I don't believe anybody wakes up and says, I want to be overweight. It's simply not a choice. Rather than blaming ourselves for a lack of discipline, let's optimize our brains and change our mindset around food. By doing this, you will free your mind from a lifetime of restriction and food obsession, and you'll teach the body how to release the excess weight. It's time to take your power back so your relationship to food can thrive rather than survive. Because after all, we are not what we eat, but we are instead what we think about what we eat. Thank you.